So hello and welcome everyone to this new tutorial about front-end development. So in the previous tutorial, we had an introduction to JavaScript where we discussed the primitive types like strings, numbers, and booleans, and the undefined type and objects. We also talked a little bit about arrays and we saw a simple DOM manipulation. In this tutorial, I will talk about functions and we'll see the scope of the functions and the use of this keyword inside the function. Then I will introduce objects and show how we can construct objects using object literals, and then how we will construct objects using functions and what this keyword here will means. And then we will see how we can assign objects and how we can modify objects using the prototype. Then we will use the for loop using these two keywords off and in, and we will see the difference between these two. And then I will introduce some new features which were introduced in 2015 in the ECMA 6 standards. These are classes, and I will show simple classes and inheritance. And then these two new keywords, let and const, which are used to define variables instead of using this var keyword here. Let's start coding. So as you can see here, I already copied our previous code from tutorial 8 and put it inside this new folder here, video 9, and I will add new HTML file. I will just call it gs2, and let's start also a new page here, and similar as before, I will put the script tag here, and inside this script tag, I will add our code here. Let's start by defining function in JavaScript. To define a function, we start by the keyword function, and then we have the name of the function, for example multiply, and then we have these two parentheses, and here we can put variables which we call the functions on. So for example, for multiplying, maybe we want to multiply two numbers, so I will have two variables, a and b, and as you can see here, we separated those variables with comma, and since this function is multiplying, so we will just return a times b. So this is a really simple functions. We pass two numbers, multiply them, and then we use this keyword return to return the value. So now we can call this function by simply calling multiply, and we need two numbers. Let's say we will multiply 10 by 2. So this should be 20, and let us log this, and let me save, and let's run this in live server as usual, and let me put live server side by side with vscode, and let's come to Chrome and press F12 to see the development tools. And as you can see here, we have our output, which is 20. So this is one way to define functions. We can also use keyword var, and then let's give the name here multiply. So we are defining a variable called multiply, and this variable will put it equal to a function. So now this multiply is a variable which stores a function. So we've seen yesterday that using this keyword var, we were able to define variables which hold strings or numbers or arrays, and now you can see that we can use it also to hold functions, and we can simply call the function by using the same name which we used here, and this should work. Let me now save, and you can see we still have here 20. So either way you can define a function and call it. So inside GS functions we can also define functions and use them. So let's say for example we want to multiply three numbers a, b, and c. For that, let's say we first define a function here inside. Let's call it multiply 2, and this function will multiply only two numbers. Let's call them, for example, a and b. So this inner function here, we will make it return a times b, and then here the outer function, let's say we'll simply call multiply 2, passing the input parameters a and b first. So these are these a and b here. We will use them to pass values to this multiply 2, and then this multiply 2 is already returned now a times b. And now if we call multiply 2 second time, this time taken as the first parameter the result of the first multiplication, and then multiplied it by c. So now the return value will be simply a times b times c, and let me call this also with the third parameter. So we already have 10 times 2 and times 2 again, and that should be like 40. Let me save, and as you can see here, this already works. So we can define functions inside functions and call them as you see here. And what you should know here is that this function multiply 2, the inner function, is not accessible from the outside. So if I wrote here something like multiply 2 and let me pass only two numbers, 10 and 2. Maybe you expect that this function multiply 2 here can be called, and then we should get 20. However, let's save, and as you can see here, we will get an error that multiply 2 is not defined. And this is because this function multiply 2 is defined inside this other function here, multiply. So it's only seen from inside this function because it's not exposed to the outer scope. So let me just put back to multiply, and here too. And let me comment this, and then we will start talking about objects. Let's see how we can define objects using lateral expressions. So we can use the keyword var, and let me define an object called point, and then the assignment operator. And here I will start with these curly brackets and close them here. And let me add the semicolon here at the end. And now inside these two curly brackets, I can define properties for this object. So since this is a point, let me define a property called x, and I will give this property a value. Let's say, for example, 10, and then a property y, and I can give it a value maybe 20, for example. And as you can see here, after each property, I'm using this comma separator. Let us log the type of this variable point. So I log the point, and as you can see here, it has two properties, x and y, with values 10 and 20. And if I look the type of this variable, you can see it's an object. And let me write here in the console, we can access the properties of these objects using a dot. So for example, we can write like point.x, and that would be 10, point.y, and that would be 20. We can add even a new properties for this object. In a similar way, we can write, let's say, point.z. If we want to add third coordinates, maybe 30. Now, if we just wrote the point to the output, you can see we have three properties. So this z property is already added here. So let me go back here to the code, and let's define a property which is a function. So that can be done in the similar way. So let me write a function which will print this point to the console. So let's call it print. And again, we use the colon, and then here we put the keyword function, and then we have these parentheses. So if we need parameters to call this function, we can put them here. But since this is a print, it will have no parameters. And let me add these curly brackets here, and then inside these curly brackets we can add our function code, and we simply here we want to log this function. So let me have a console.log, and I will log it in a different way. So I will write point, then I will use these parentheses, and then I will put the x coordinate, and let me write it now like this. So I will write x plus, then I will have a comma, then the y coordinates, then closing parentheses, and let me save. And then let's call also this function here and see what will happen. So you can see here we have an exception that x is not defined, so that x here is not defined. So the JavaScript compiler was not able to detect that we mean actually that it should use this x here, and for that we need to add the keyword this and then a dot. So now this keyword returns to the current scope, and since this function here is inside the object point, so this will mean the point, and then this x after the dot be meant this x here. So even if we have a variable here in the outside called x, let's give it a value of 5, and then this dot x will be pointing to this property inside the point and not to the outer variable. And let me maybe here define a variable y, and I will give it a value of 4, and let me keep this y here like this without this keyword, and let's save. And now as you can see here, this function print has outputted 10 for the x, 4 for the y. So this 10 for the x came from this property here, while the value of y did not came from this property, but rather from this outer variable y. So let us then now correct this and use the this keyword, and now we have the correct output. So now let's say that we want to create a new point starting from our already defined point. So let's define a new variable point 2, and maybe you want to do something like call point, and then let's say for example that you want to change the coordinates of point 2. So let's put x coordinate to 20, and let me now print both points after this operation. So we'll print point and point 2, and let's see what would happen. Let me comment these two print statements here, and let's save. So you can see that although we are printing the 2 points, we get the same coordinates here, 20, 20. So basically when we change the coordinate of this second variable here, that has been reflected to the original variables here, and that's because this assignment here is only assigning of this variable here on the right hand side point to the one on the left hand side point 2. And to construct a new object, we need to use function from the object, and this function called create. So we write simply object.create, and then we pass prototype, which is our point, and that's it. Now if we save, you can see that we have the first coordinate here 10, 20, while the second one is 20, 20. So now we really have two different objects in memory, and this is how we can create new instances of this object point. Another way to construct objects is actually to use function constructs. That's done in a different way somehow. So let's do that now. Let me define a function, and let's call it point. And usually, since I know that we will use this function to construct objects, I started with a uppercase P, not in a lowercase. So that's a convention in JavaScript. We can pass parameter for this function. So let's say that we want to pass the x and y values. And then of course, since this is a function, we have the curly brackets, and inside this function, I want to use now keyword this. So since this will be used as a constructor function, I know that this will be referring to the object we are constructing. So I can add a property for this object called x, and I will assign the input x to it. So let me have a different name, maybe here with underscore. So x underscore y underscore. So this x here would be the one of the input, so the x underscore. Of course, we can use x here, but just not to confuse you, I did it like this. And then we also define the y property, and similarly we can define also a print function. So I can use this to print, and I can put it to exactly this function here. So and that's it. And now to construct a new object, let's say point3. So we simply write var point3 equal, and then we use the keyword new. So this is the keyword used to construct objects. And then after that, we call our constructor function point, and we pass the values for the x and y. So let's give it 1 and 2. And let me then print this point3. And let us save. And as you can see here, we already got a point which have coordinates 1 and 2. And now we can, in the same way, define other points. So let's say point 4 and 5, and then we can also give them some new values. Let's say here 3 and 4, and then 5 and 6 here, and let's print them. And as you can see, we are already constructing new objects. Let us now talk about the prototype of the object. So we've seen before, we can, for example, come here for point 5, and let us give it another coordinate z, and give it a value of 7, for example. And then let's log this to the console. As you can see here, so z is equal to 7. Maybe you also want to have a z property also for the other points. So let's see what would happen if we wrote, for example, point4.z. And as you can see here, it's undefined. And that's because we added this z property only for point 5, but it's never been added to point 4. So in JavaScript, we can actually add one property for all the variables which are constructed with this point. And that's simply done by using the prototype. So to use the prototype, first we want to get the prototype, and let me save it in this variable called proto. And getting the prototype is done using object.getPrototypeOf, and then we pass the object we want the prototype for, and here in our case, for example, point 5. And then instead of writing point5.z, we will write proto.z. So this is the prototype of our object, and we are assigning the value 7 for the z coordinates, and this will practically assign this 7 to all objects which are constructed in the same way. And now point 4 will also have a property z, and it should have also the same value 7. And let us save, and you can see here that now we have both z values set to 7. But what about the first 2 points? So point and point 2. Let us check the z property of these 2 points. And as you can see here, it's undefined. That's because these 2 points are created using different prototype. So we defined this point using this object lateral, and then we created point 2 from this point. So that means actually these 2 points have the same prototype. And since we created all the other points using this function construct, that means these other points have a different prototype. So now for point and point 2, we can do the same here. Let me copy this. But instead of calling get property of point 5, let's just call of point. So that will give us the prototype which we need. And let me save. And now, as you can see, they all have value 7. And maybe to distinguish this, let me put this maybe to 5. And you can see that point 4 and 5 have a z coordinate of 7, while point and point 2 have 5. So just let me add also the other points, and let me add point 3 and arrange these. So we start by point, and let's call it point 1, and let's save. And you can see that point 1 and 2 have coordinate 5, and the others have 7. Now let me comment this output, and let us start talking about for using the keywords in and of. And let's use this to enumerate the properties of objects. And that's done in the following way. So we write for, and let us define a variable p for a property. And let's use first the keyword in, and then we choose one of these objects, maybe point 1, and let us log the value of p. So as you can see here, we have the properties x, y, print, and z. In a similar way, we can use the keyword of. So this kind of for loops using keyword in is used to enumerate over the properties of objects. And we have a similar construct with the keyword of. However, this construct is not used for objects. So if I now save, you will see we got an error here because it's telling us that this object point 1 is not iterable. And That's because this of keyword expects an array on the right hand side. So let's define an array. In the previous tutorial, we defined arrays using arrays literal. We can also use the new keyword and we define a new array. And as you can see here, this expects array length. We can keep it also empty if you like. And then we can push elements to this array. So let's push some elements like 1, 2, and 3. And then here, let's iterate over the elements of this array. And let me save. And now you can see that this array contains 1, 2, and 3. Of course, we can use the in loop over the array, and let me save now. And you can see that in the array we have the properties 0, 1, and 2, and those are the indices actually, because we have now 3 elements and the indices start from 0 to 2. And we have a property called z, and this could be confusing, but I think I made a mistake then here when I was defining the prototypes. Yeah, came from this prototype here. Let me change that. So I should actually here have used object dot define a property, and then here I would give the object prototype. So here it's called proto, and then the name of the property, so it should be z, and then here we define a getter for this property, so the getter should be an object, and then here we have keyword get, and then the get should be a function which will, let's say, will simply return the value 5. So let's return 5, and let me save this. And now you can see that here we don't have this set property, and just to be sure that this set property should only be defined to this point 1 and point 2. Let me just uncomment this, and you can see now that we have for point 1, point 2, the z is 5, and for the other points it's 7. Yeah, maybe another comment here, since I'm back to this prototype, we can get the prototype for this function constructor using point in another way. So we can also use point.prototype, and that will end up doing the same effect. So let me save, and you can see that this output here is not changed. That's enough about the prototype. Let's go back to our for loops, and let me comment this again. So now you can see that the array will have properties which are the indices. So also, not to be confused, let me put this as larger number so you can see that those are the values. So here we are iterating over the values since this array have 3 values. And here when we use in keyword, we are iterating over the properties. Now let me, for example, here define a property for this array. Let's call it prop string, and then give it string value, and let's save. And as you can see here, so the first loop using the of still iterating over the values of the array, while the second loop here, which are iterating over the properties of the array, now we have the indices, and in addition to that we have this string property. So be careful when you're using for loops with array, and mostly we want to use this of property here to loop over the entries, and not this in here, which is used to loop over the properties of objects. Now let me comment these lines here, and let us move to a new topic, which is classes. In JavaScript, similar to languages like Java and C++, has a way to construct classes, and this is done using the class keyword. So let's start a class definition using the class keyword, and then we need the name of the class. So I want to define again a point here. However, since we used it to define a function, we will get an error, as you can see here. So if I wrote class point, we get here identifier point has already been declared. So let me call this class just pnt, and then as before, so for this class we want to define properties, or as we call them for the class member variables. So I will define x, and now we can add here a semicolon and then y, and then we can also add functions as before. So let's say print, and similar to our point object, we want to write the x and y, and for distinguishing, let's put here only pnt, and let me save. And now we can define variables from this class. So let's say pnt1, and it should be a new pnt, and let's call pnt1.print. And as you can see here, so we got a pnt and then undefined, because here this x and y have never been assigned a value. So we can assign default values here, for example, zeros. Let me save. Now you can see the point is 0, 0. And in the classes, we can also have a constructor. And for that, we have the keyword constructor. and let us use x and y as an input for this constructor, and then we will just put this dot x equal x and this dot y equal y. And now if we saved, you can see here we are back. So now our print function is outputting undefined for this x and y, and that's because now this constructor is called. However, here we called it with no parameters, so this x and y here, they are undefined, and then we are assigning them to x and y to this x and y, and then these two here got undefined, and that's why we get undefined here. So let's give them then some values here. Let's say 5, 4, and now you can see that we have a point of 5, 4, and similarly we can define more points, maybe bnt2, and let's give it other coordinates, and you can see how this would work. So in classes, we can also define getters and setters. Let's say, for example, that here we call our x and y variables like this, and then we need to change this print function here. And let's say we want to have a getter and setter for this x and y. So we can have, for example, get x, which is a function, and this function will simply return this dot x. And then we can also have a set x, and this function should have a variable, maybe let's call it x, and it simply put this dot x to this variable. Same for the y, let's define a getter and setter. Now this can be used like this, so we can have a pnt1 dot x, and we can put it to a value maybe 55, and same for y, let's put it 44. Let's save, and you can see now that the x and y coordinate has changed. That's it about getters and setters. Another useful construct in classes is the inheritance, so we can define another class which inherits from this point. Let's say, for example, that we want to have a z coordinates, so we can define a class bntz, let's say, or bnt3, so since it will have x and y and z, and this class inherits from the point using keyword extends, and then we put the name of the parent class, which is in our case bnt. Now again, here we have the curly brackets, so now our bnt3 class will have all the properties and functions of this class bnt, and then we can add even more. And what we want to add here is the z coordinates, and let's also assign it a default value of 0, and let's change also the constructor. So the constructor, we wanted now to have 3 values, so x, y, and z. And the first thing we want to do is to call constructor of the parent class, which is bnt, and for that we can use the keyword super, and this means the parent class, and we can put parentheses, and as you can see, vscode is already showing us that we can have an x and a y values. So let's put here the x and y, which we get here as an input, and then we want to assign the z value to our member variable underscore z. So now we have a point3 object which have an x, y, and z values. So let's override the function print, and I will do it in the same way, but only here I will add an extra comma, then the z coordinates, and that's it. And let us maybe also define a getter and setter for the z coordinate. And now we can create instances of this new class. So let's take point3 to be from type point3, and let's add the third coordinate for that, and then call the function print. And you can see now function print is called on this object here, and it printed our 3 coordinates. This way of constructing classes using the class keyword and extending that has been introduced in 2015. And with it also there was new features in JavaScript to defining variables using the keywords let and const. So I will start using these, and that's done as follows. So we can define, for example, a constant point. Let's call it bnt4, and again this is maybe from type bnt3, and let's pass 1, 2, and 3 as coordinates, and again let's print it and save. So you can see this will work correctly. So the const keyword signals that this variable bnt4 cannot be changed. So let's try to change it, for example, by assigning a new value to it, even it is with the same parameters. And now if I saved, you can see here we have assignment to a constant variables. So using the var keyword, don't get such a errors as you see here. So let me first comment this line. So you can see that there was no errors here, although here we are doing 2 things. So basically we are assigning a value to a variable, and we are defining it again because we used the keyword var here again. So with the const and the lit, this cannot happen. So now let me use the lit and define a 0.5, and let's give it value of 1, 2, 3, and let's also print this point. Now in contrast to the var, so now if I try to again define this variable and save, you can see that here 0.5 has already been declared. So we cannot define it twice in the same scope, and same also will happen here for const, of course. You can see that VS Code is already recognized this. So let me remove these two lines here. However, what we can do now with the lit is we can reassign a new value to this variable. So for example, I can put that 0.5 is equal 1, 2, 3 again, or maybe let me put this as 4 and save. And you can see now when we print it, it will have the value of 4. So you can see that using the lit and const will make our code better. So we hopefully have less bugs. And that's why it's preferred to use these new keywords instead of using the var. However, if you want to support older devices or browsers which are made before 2015, you have to use the var keyword. Let me now comment all the outputs here, and let me copy our loop from the previous tutorial for adding elements to the DOM, and let me put it here, and let's run it. And you can see here our document similar to the previous tutorial. Let us add now more styles to this output, and let's make this array an array of points, and maybe we'll use the const keyword for that. So const a, and then here we define new points with some coordinates 1, 3, and let us add also maybe styles for this class. So let's say back color and forecolor. So we are using strings to define the colors. Back color would be white and the forecolor is green as default. And let's add those in the constructor also. So let's put them here. So maybe for the first point, let's keep it to white and maybe put the forecolor to black. While for the second point, maybe we will put the forecolor to green. And for the third point, let's put the back color to black and the forecolor to white. And now we can use these properties here in our DOM, and let us add the function which will give us the point as a string. So there is already this function called toString. Let us override it and make it return this custom string here which we built before. And then here inside our for loop, instead of typing the elements as array index equals something, we will use this string here. So we will take ai.toString, and that's used as an inner text. And now we want to use the back color and forecolor. And for that, remember that our div here is an HTML element. And for that, there is a property called style, which we can use. And we will see later that also we can add even classes as we were doing in the CSS tutorials. But now let's just use the style. And the style has a background color, as you can see here. And then we can assign for that the AI.background color. So as you can see here, we are accessing this background without a property, which also can be done. And then we will also use the forecolor property here, and we'll put it to the forecolor. And let us save. Then we will use also the color property. And now let us change the color of the text. So for that, we will use the property color and put it to the forecolor. And let us save. And now you can see here that we have the first point with a black forecolor, and here the forecolor is green, and here we have a background which is black with a forecolor which is white. So now you already have a good information about JavaScript. In the next tutorials, I will try to do more DOM manipulation, which is the main purpose of the JavaScript code. So be tuned for the next tutorial. For now, I wish you a good day, and don't forget to subscribe and like. Bye.